So we can start with the talk by Giovanni Fantuzzi, who is professor at the Department of Mathematics at the university. Please.
All right, thanks. So in the interest of time, I'll try to keep it short. I'd also like it to be informal, as informal as possible. So if you have questions during the talk, please interrupt and ask. I want to start by saying that this is work mostly by Albert, who's a PhD student here in the chair, and also with Enrique, who has given a lot of the good ideas behind this. Albert couldn't be here, so I'm presenting his work for him today. And the problem we look at is this, I call it exact sequence prediction with transformers. So to understand that, let me just, hopefully, jump slide. So in a nutshell, what is the problem? We have these machine learning models, which are transformers. I consider them to be a function. We give them some input, like a sentence that we want to be completed, and we will like this machine to spit out a set of possible completions for this sentence, like in this case, dog, cat, or mathematician, right? We're known to be lazy. So, of course, maybe you want also probability of these outputs, but to a first approximation, let me just assume that this is the task. So how do we model this mathematically? Well, let's suppose that we take every word and we encode every word through a process called tokenization as a vector. So now I have a bunch of vectors, and I want my transformer to spit out a different bunch of vectors that somehow can then maybe be decoded into words. So more generally, I have an input set, or I'm going to call it an input sequence with n tokens. Every token is a vector in RD. And I would like to pass it through this transformer, which takes this sequence as input, and spits out a different sequence with a different number, perhaps, of elements, usually less in the application that we have in mind, also in the same dimension. And so the capital letters in my talk will denote sequences, and the small letters, lowercase letters, will denote vectors in RD. Okay, so this is the task. The question that we were asking is, can we have exact prediction? So if I give you pairs of input-outputs, right? This is like your training data. Can you build a transformer that classifies, well, that predicts inputs, that predicts outputs from inputs exactly for all of your data, right? So the transformer applied to your input should give exactly the output, right? So that's the question we are asking. The question you should be asking is, who cares, right? In practice, you might not want to do exact prediction because maybe you overfit. So what's the point, right? And the point is that there are implications for practical training. And this is a mathy slide that essentially rediscovers Tikhonov regularization. So essentially, if you have a class of transformers that depends continuously on your parameters that you use in the training, right? And you can solve the exact prediction problem. So there is a transformer in that class that precisely classifies your outputs, your inputs and turns them into the outputs. Then you can, of course, find a transformer with minimal parameter norm that does it. And it turns out that you can use that transformer in order to put an upper bound. Hopefully you see the pointer here. So I can consider a standard training process where I have a cost function, which is the standard loss over the training set, plus maybe some regularization of the parameters with some parameter epsilon, right? Hopefully epsilon is not too large. And then you can estimate that the optimal transformer here gives you a cost, so a total loss function, which is bounded by the norm of this precise exact transformer times epsilon, right? So you know that your best solution should do better than this constant times epsilon. And in fact, you know that if you crank epsilon towards 0, then these optimal solutions will actually converge to a perfect classifier, right? So maybe this sounds abstract, but in pictures, the situation looks like the following. So suppose you start training. So you have training iterations in the horizontal axis, and you measure your loss on your training set. And perhaps you see that after a few iterations, your loss levels off, right? Should you stop training? Well, the question is, well, maybe the theory tells you that the minimum loss should be below this dashed line. That's the question, the constant times epsilon for the computation. And if you knew this, well, you should say, well, no, I need to keep training, and then maybe you level off. No, you should keep training again. And only then you know that you have a good transformer. Okay? So that's the interest of why we care about this perfect classification. There are practical implications for training. So again, can we solve this perfect prediction problem? Of course, the answer depends on, well, what is the transformer? What is the architecture? In fact, this question has nothing to do with transformer. I could have used any machine learning model here, right? So whether I can do it depends on the class of models that I care about, and in particular here I care about transformers, but even then there are a million different ways in which you can set up transformers. So let us look at the architecture that we considered. So what we did was consider a simple transformer that has the following structure. So it's a big function that consists of a concatenation of many transformer blocks, B1, B2, and so forth to BL, that take the input sequence, Z, with n tokens, and massages it to give another sequence at L, which also has n tokens. And then the desired output has m tokens, smaller number, so we need to add something called a readout map that in our case just looks at the last sequence ZL and removes any duplicates. So it just looks at the unique tokens after the sequence of transformer blocks. Okay? And after that, we get some output. Of course, we have the freedom. What do the transformers block do? So let's zoom in, and we have the following. So every block takes in a sequence with n tokens and spits out another sequence with n tokens. And it does the following. So the first, it applies a feed-forward layer, or a multi-layer perceptron layer, to each token in your sequence. So you take the sequence Z, and you apply a map feed-forward, FF, to every token inside ZK. And that does the following operation. In fact, maybe I can point. So you take your token Z, you apply a linear transformation, so you get UZ plus B, where U and B are training matrices and weights. And then you zero out negative entries. So that's like the ReLU activation function. We multiply the result by W, which is another trainable matrix, and then we add the result to a multiple of Z. So here you could think of alpha being like 0, 1 if you want a residual connection or not, but you could actually add it as a parameter that you can use in training to decide how much weight you want to put to the residual connection versus the activation. And so after you've done this operation on every token, you get another sequence. You take this sequence and you pass it to a second block or second layer, which is a self-attention layer. And then again, this creates a new sequence where we take this intermediate sequence, let's call it Z, and we apply a bunch of self-attention functions to it, right? And the way we do it is for every entry of this big sequence, we have some attention function, which I will describe in a second, which depends on some parameter, which creates a vector. We multiply this by some value matrix V, and then we add that to a residual connection, again, with some weight beta that we're allowed to train. So every parameter that you see here in red is some trainable parameter of the model. Okay? So this is the math, but we can actually look at pictures to understand what is going on so that we can get a feeling for how these transformers operate. So let's start with the feed-forward layers. So what I will do is I will focus on layers that have width 4. So that means that in this expression here, the matrix U is 4 times D. D is the dimension of the vector Z. The vector B has 4 entries, and the matrix W is D by 4. Right? And the reason why I do that is because I can make a very specific choice. So now it looks even worse. But I can group terms inside these matrices, and I can talk about neurons. And I will have a first neuron, which will depend on some vector W1 and other linear transformations, and the other 3 neurons will share the same vector W2. And the reason for this is very geometric. So the action of the first neuron is to take an input sequence, which is the blue dots, and it makes every point move by a certain step along a certain direction of a vector. So what this neuron is doing, it takes the points and it shifts them along a particular direction. What the other 3 neurons of the layer are doing is they're putting a tube in space, and they're moving only the points that fall inside that tube. So very geometrically, you get that the points outside of this green tube remain fixed, and then the other ones get shifted along a certain direction W2 by an amount that depends on the distance from the boundaries of the tube. So if you're on the boundary of the tube, you don't move, and if you're in the middle, you move a lot, okay? And if you combine these two effects, you get this sort of geometrical picture that tells you that these feed-forward layers are basically taking a bunch of points, and they are shifting everything along a certain direction, and then everything that's in the tube actually gets a perturbation. But at the end of the day, you're moving points around. And this geometric intuition is kind of nice because then you can do constructions by hand of transformers. Okay, so that's the geometric intuition for the feed-forward layers. What about self-attention? Well, here I said there is some attention function that does something. I haven't told you what that is. So let's look at what it is. Like for computations, if you're trying to train these transformers in practice, you use something called a softmax, which is a horribly complicated expression, but what this is doing is it's taking a weighted sum of all of your tokens, where the weights have some complicated expression that depend on exponential. That's just a weighted average of everyone. So you have a bunch of words in your sentence. You're somehow looking at some weighted average of those words. And you decide your weights using this formula. For math, it's actually more useful to look at what we call the hardmax attention, where instead of looking at a weighted average over everyone, we look at a simple average over what I like to call influencers. So I pick a few words that are important, and I use those to determine what is going on. And these influencers solve a certain maximization problem. This is the math. I'll show you a picture in a moment. Before I do that, let me just tell you what is the link between this softmax and hardmax. Well, it turns out that they are related, and you see there's an epsilon here in this formula. If you take this epsilon and fix everything else, and you let this epsilon go to 0, then the softmax formula becomes exactly the hardmax. Okay, so there's an approximation argument that goes on behind the scenes. And the reason why you like to use the softmax in practice is because it's smooth, continuous in the parameters, whereas the hardmax is not. But the hardmax has a very nice geometric intuition, which is the following. So how do I find out influencers? So here's my tokens, points in some Euclidean space, in this case a plane. And let's suppose that I select the token Zi, and I want to find the attention for that. So what I do is I have my parameter matrix A inside this layer, so I multiply A by Zi, and I get another point. You look at the line that goes through that point. You project everyone else on that line, and then you take the point that has the largest projection. So that's the influencer. And then, of course, you want to repeat this for all other points. So every point will have its own influencer. Okay, so again, this is very geometric, and that means that we can work with it. So in a nutshell, this is the geometric intuition behind all of this formula. And so now we understand that these math formula are just moving points around. We can play with them. So let's zoom back out. We wanted to construct this transformer with this complicated sequence where we keep alternating this feed forward and the attention and the feed forward and the attention until we get something. We apply a readout, and we should get another sequence. And hopefully, we can do it in a way that we solve our perfect matching problem between given inputs and given outputs. Okay? So what we actually managed to do, thanks to this geometric intuition, is you give me any set of inputs, and they could be sequences of arbitrary length, as long as they're finite, so they don't need to all have the same length. You could just give me a sentence to complete, a book to complete, a whole library to complete. That's fine. And then you give me corresponding targets, right? So the possible completions. The assumption is that the completion size, so the M size of Y, is smaller than the N size of Z. Then we can construct explicitly by hand the parameters of a transformer that solves the perfect prediction problem. And the complexity of this explicit hardmax transformer is of the order of N, the number of samples that you want to match, plus basically the sum of all the size of the outputs. Because the size of the outputs is bigger than 1, and you have N of them, actually this is the term that dominates. In fact, in each layer, we have order detunable parameters. So we have, in fact, explicit constants for these estimates, but I don't want to present them. But the point is that we can actually take, you might be surprised that there's order D complexity because I'm multiplying by matrices, so maybe you expect a D square. But the point is that we can take, for example, this matrix A in the transformers to be of rank 1 plus an identity, so that limits the number of parameters. Okay, so we can prove this result. I will not show you the proof because I don't think it's worth it, but it's actually just moving points around the plane and designing correctly the parameters to move the points in the right way so that we can put them to the target that we want. And that's why the geometric intuition of the hardmax is easy. So what are the implications for practical training in this case? Well, that was the picture, and that's what we would hope to see. But if you look at the math, there's a statement that says the transformer depends continuously on the trainable parameters. Too bad. That's false for the hardmax, right? So does that mean that the analysis that we've done means nothing? Well, fortunately, because hardmax and softmax are related, we can actually rescue the situation. We have to work a little bit harder, but we can prove the similar perfect classification result for the softmax transformer. And the proof strategy is similar. There are some technicalities, but the result is basically the same. The only thing that I've done is replace hardmax with softmax, right? And at this point, because we know that we can solve with enough complexity, enough layers, enough blocks in your transformer, we can solve this perfect matching problem, then we should be able to find bounds on the optimal loss, which should inform the training. So we're currently working on these examples. We haven't managed to complete them yet, but hopefully that will be done soon. Okay, so I think I'm perfectly on time. So in summary, what did I show you? That these hardmax and softmax transformers, I'm going to say without normalization, because in practice you might want to normalize the output of every layer. I haven't done that yet. But if you assume that you don't want to normalize, then we can solve these exact sequence prediction problems. You give me any set of inputs and any set of outputs with smaller dimension, then I can match it, provided that your transformer is complex enough. Interestingly, the construction is independent of this input length. You can give me a sentence, you can give me a paragraph, you can give me a book, you can give me a library. Complexity is completely independent of the length of the input sequence. What it does depend on is the number of inputs and outputs that you want to match. And if you listen to François' talk, then maybe there's hundreds of millions of these samples, right? So our construction is very expensive because that would mean that you need a transformer with hundreds of millions of blocks. And in practice, you see much better accuracy for a simple architecture. So we cannot quite explain the practical efficiency of transformers, but I think this is a step in the right direction. We know how to construct them, right? Maybe for particular examples, even if you have a lot of data, you can construct probably a simple transformer to achieve perfect classification, and this will explain 99.8% accuracy for some tasks. Okay, so the open question here would be to reduce the complexity with a number of samples. What's nice is that everything is completely explicit, right? I can train the transformers just by hand, essentially. I can give it to you if you're patient enough to wait for me to do all the calculations. And it is purely geometric, so there's a lot of intuition here. You know, it sounds like these fancy machines, but actually, you really are just moving points around. The one thing that is left, as I mentioned, is in practice, you not only move points, but after you've moved points, you don't want the points to sort of go to infinity, so you normalize them back. We haven't taken this normalization into account in our construction, but we think it should be doable. And so that's also another open problem that we will look into. With that, I thank you for your attention. Some of the work is already published, so I invite you to look at the papers. Albert is more than happy to answer questions and to engage in discussions. So if you want, as I said, this is mostly his work, so I invite you to get in touch with him. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there questions? Okay, coming.
Thank you. When you presented the results, and especially the geometric drawing, this looks a lot like the SVM of before, you know, the generalized portrait from Vapnik. and then the SVM, because the support vector of the SVM are exactly the influence point you mentioned. So my question to you is, aren't you showing here that in fact a small FFN plus attention mechanism, a hard or soft max, actually perform like kind of a minimal support vector machine, and therefore can enjoy of the same probability? And then, you know, a good thing there is that this might solve your problem of complicated for large n, because the whole point of the support vectors was that you didn't need to scale them up to n, because a lot of the data points would be classified by the previous ones. That was the exact point of the support vector. I don't know if this makes sense, but...
we haven't thought about it in that way. It's certainly an interesting suggestion. The difficulty here, that maybe perhaps where the difference arises, is that I'm not classifying points as such. I am classifying sequences, and then these sequences can overlap. So if you're thinking of having two different sentences, the word the or the word is will appear in many of these sentences. And so if you think of this single word as a pointing space, then this pointing space might have to have two different paths depending on which sample it belongs to. So the attention, the fact that there's non-locality within a certain sample has to play a role.
Yeah, this is true. You would definitely need to adapt you know, the initial description and the paradigm in SVM to this. But I feel, you know, this notion of maximal margin and moving the thing and then looking at the influencers and moving things around is extremely close to the sequence of algorithm that led to the SVM originally. Before they thought of it as, before they thought of them as kernel, you know, the original geometric intuition behind SVM.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, we should think about it. So maybe we should talk more. Thanks.
Okay, I think we can thank again our speaker.